especially if you love disco and late 70s and early 80s dance music. And today we are going to talk about a gentleman who I personally have crowned. This is just my nickname for him. I mean, other people probably have called him different things, but this late gentleman, I affectionately refer to him as the J-Dilla of Disco. Like, how people were, huge Dilla fans undercover, and well, not undercover necessarily, but he was more like an underground type of artist and producer that people, just loved. And his untimely passing hurt people, still does, because I mean, Dilla was super important to hip hop and black music in general. But this gentleman has sort of a similar story, even though he lived a lot longer, but he just passed away a couple of years ago. Cancer sucks, by the way. Just want to get that out of the way. I'm talking about Mr. Patrick Adams. And why do I call him the J Dilla of Disco? Because it's very simple. He's not the Bee Gees. He's not Nile Rodgers. He's not, anybody in the Sound of Philadelphia camp, Kenny Gamble, Leon Huff, Tom Bell. He is one of the most unsung, underrated underground producers of all time. And he did some crazy disco records that if you weren't in the clubs back then in the 70s and in the early 80s, you didn't hear them. Because, I mean, none of Patrick Adams' work really traveled nationwide. Well, except for a couple of instances, and we'll talk about those shortly. But Mr. Adams was clearly an asset to the dance music community, and he was also, believe it or not, he also had a hand in the golden age of hip hop. Yes, he did. And we'll talk about that in a second. But his story begins in 1950 in Harlem, New York. He was born to his father, who was a merchant, and his mother, who was the homemaker. Like, so while Pops was out sailing, making that money, Mom was at home keeping the peace with Patrick and his two siblings. But he was musically inclined from an early age. He could play a multitude of instruments, and being in Harlem, right down the street from the Apollo. So what did he do? He would just hang out at the Apollo and, watch all the musicians of the era. And this is, of course, when the Motortown Review was popping in the early 60s. So he said, you never forget. The best piece of advice ever come from who else? Smokey Robinson. He said he was 13. He asked Smokey, Mr. Robinson, what would your advice be to me if I wanted to do what you do? And he said, Smokey told him 2 words, forget it. And Patrick said, that's cool, because if I was deterred by those 2 words, I was never going to be anything, which is pretty good damn reverse psychology when you think about it. But anyway, he eventually becomes a trusted Apollo pianist, and he's like 16, 17 years old doing all of this stuff. And he eventually discovers this group named Black Ivory. Of course, Leroy Burgess is one of the other underground early 80s hit makers that people don't know about, but him and Patrick were real tight for a long time. And Leroy Burgess was the lead singer of Black Ivory, and Patrick Adams produced a lot of their earlier stuff, which was more like slow, soulful stuff, like, kind of like I won't say a poor man's version of Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions, but I'll just say more like a Harlemized version of the Impressions. We'll say Black Ivory was. Regardless, he was also doing jingles at the time. There's a funny story. Like, most of this information you can find if you look up Patrick Adams Red Bull Academy. Red Bull Music Academy was super important, and I'm so sad that it's no longer with us, because you learned a lot about different genres of music in different eras, different regions, and all of that. And we need something like Red Bull Music Academy back. Hopefully somebody gets the bright idea to start something similar, because these stories need to be told. But yeah, he did an entire thing with the legendary music writer Jeff Mao, or Chairman Mao as he's known. And Chairman Mao was the host, and Patrick was talking about all of these things. And he said he was doing arrangements. Like, this is just music nerd shit. So there was a trumpet player that noticed that he was writing out every single note. But if you're going to write, but if it's a note that's meant to be played over and over, you don't have to write the same note 16 times or whatever. So, I mean, he's probably like 18, 19 at the time. And this woman is like a veteran studio musician or whatever. Like, and she pulls him to the side and says, you don't know what you're doing, do you? And Patrick's like, no, I don't. And she's like, don't worry about it. We got you. And even after that, Perception Records still loved everything he did. So with Black Ivory and the commercials, so he was like their main dude. But by the middle of the 70s, he wasn't making a lot of money. Because here's the thing. Record companies are shady no matter what era. I mean, you can take it back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and you damn sure take it 70s, 80s, 90s, 21st century. So Patrick decides to leave Perception Records and do his own thing. He co-founded P&P Records with Peter Brown. Not Do You Want to Get Funky with Me, Peter Brown, but another Peter Brown who was a veteran music man. And he fell into the disco thing. I think he said that his lady at the time took him to a gay club. And during Pride Month, I think that's an important thing to say because, if you're a straight guy in a gay club, and this is 1975, 76-ish, I guess. And when you walk into that setting, it takes you have to be open-minded. And by all accounts, Patrick Adams was a very open-minded gentleman. It's like he was just taking in the sounds, the aura and everything. And he also said that disco was a way for him to have fun with the music because he said, somebody said he was a horrible keyboard player. And he was like, I was just fooling around. He said Hendrix did the same thing. He said, and y'all bought that shit. But yeah, this is where disco really gets to be interesting because yes, you have active disco bands, but you also have producers that would also have these indie labels that could, they could write and produce their own stuff. And all they'd have to do is either call on musicians or singers to do the music with them. But they were more like studio musicians and singers. So, and it was like a one-off thing. Like one of his one-offs was Cloud One. And there's two songs from that Cloud One album that absolutely stand out: Atmospheric Strut and Disco Juice. And if you haven't heard those, because again, if you weren't in the club in New York in the 70s, you weren't hearing them. So those are two records you definitely need to hear. He also had a side project, we'll say, called Bumblebee Unlimited. And there was the song, Just Let Me Be Your Ladybug, 24 hours a day, I'll give you love. And it's funny because Patrick said he got the idea from watching Saturday Night Live and the Belushi brothers doing like this Bumblebee costume shit. I've never seen it, but I trust that it happened. It was the 70s. Everybody was out of their mind stoned and the creativity was flowing free. So yes. And he also did what is termed as one of the horniest records ever recorded. And it was one of the biggest disco hits of not just 1978, but of all time by the group Musique, Musique. And it's called Push Push in the Bush. Now, this is one of those things where you don't have to guess where this song is going. It's not like me earlier in recording these episodes, discovering an alternate meaning of Voyage to Atlantis. You already know, in the bush, because back in the day, people didn't shave. People didn't shave down there. I'm not gonna say how else I know people didn't shave in the 70s, but research will tell you. Just saying. But yeah, Push Push in the Bush was one of the horniest records ever made. Like if you've never heard that 8-minute horn dog fest, I highly recommend you do. It's very up tempo, it's very upbeat, but yeah, you can hear the moaning in the background, the lyrics. Yeah, it's freaky. It's freaky for. Yeah, I think that's probably something Kendrick Lamar would have felt out of place in the 70s because a whole bunch of freaky ass niggas would need to stay their ass inside. Everybody was horny in the 70s. And there's also another song from later on in 78, early in 79, Caught Up in a One-Night Love Affair by Inner Life. And that's Jocelyn Brown, who, of course, later became known for Somebody Else's Guy. And that song is probably one of the classiest disco records ever recorded. And it's literally a song about it's the disco lifestyle. You meet somebody in the club, you guys are dancing, you're having a good time. That libido is starting to kick in. Y'all are horny, but you're also, kind of looking for companionship because even though people partied in excess back then, loneliness could still be a thing. So you could just be wanting to have somebody close by, just have somebody close by. And Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair is a perfect example of that. You know, the end of the second verse goes, "I'm a fairy tale princess in search of a knight, and I've never believed in fairy tales. I'm just like you. I'm caught up in a one night love affair." That's a woman that's saying, "I know that we're probably not gonna see each other again after we do what we do, but you know, we're here, we're feeling it. Let's go for it." And that's how it goes. But also, um, Mr. Adams unfortunately got caught up in that disco demolition night forces, that disco sucks thing that absolutely killed disco. And when your main source of income literally goes from you being able to buy a house and a car to you not even being able to, keep Bell Atlantic or whatever telephone company was at the time off your case, it can be a bit of a challenge. But the thing about Patrick Adams is he wasn't just a producer and arranger. He also learned how to mix and overdub and master, so he became a studio engineer in the 80s. What happens in the 1980s? Hip hop. And he actually helped a lot of the production on Eric B. and Rakim's Paid in Full. So he mentions Rakim's, voice was one of the greatest instruments he had ever heard. So he learned how to record him better. So that's why Paid in Full sounds so damn good, because Patrick Adams engineered it. And people were like, "Man, you should have took producer credit." And he was like, "I didn't want producer credit this time." He's like, in his later interviews, he say he would regret. In later interviews, he would say he regretted it because he felt like he could have been, the Dr. Dre of the '80s, which makes sense. But I think what makes Patrick Adams stuff so interesting, because I've listened to, Atmospheric Strut, Disco Juice, couple other Cloud One records that I'm forgetting by name, In the Bush, Ladybug, all of these, fun songs, Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair. There's just a different level of genius that comes with fooling around in the studio and still making records that people remember 45, 50 years later. And I mean, Patrick Adams didn't take disco seriously, and that's not being disrespectful to disco. That's just Patrick Adams saying, okay, this is a trend of music that is fun to make, and you don't have to think twice about it because you've already got a template. Because of course we already mentioned that Earl Young's 4 on the Floor pattern became disco's calling card, and any drummer worth their salt could play 4 on the floor. So, I mean, even if you weren't like a professional drummer, you probably could still play 4 on the floor fairly easily. And that's why a lot of these, that's why disco was, ended up being kind of oversaturated, because everybody could do it. That's why you had those ridiculous. That's why you had a ridiculous record like Disco Duck from Rick Dees, which was basically insulting everyone in the disco community. I mean, Disco Duck is the suckiest song of all time, dog. Like it's the worst song ever written and recorded, because it's obviously, slamming disco. And again, that anti-disco backlash that had a lot to do with racism, had a lot to do with sexism, had a lot to do with homophobia. It all just tied together. But yeah, the thing about 4 on the Floor is if you had a drummer that could play it, and you had the musicians that could play guitar around it, play bass around it, play horn around it, do the strings around it, you could make a disco record, a convincing disco record. And Patrick Adams chose to make convincing disco records that were fun. Like he's doing all the voices on the Ladybug song, y'all. He's doing all the voices. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous in all the best ways. And you don't need lyrics for something like Disco Juice, because it's just like very spacey sound. Same for Atmospheric Strut. Atmospheric Strut, I think, has one lyric: "We're gonna fly away, we're gonna fly," because atmosphere, you're out in the atmosphere. Atmospheric strut, you strutting, you flying away. So yeah, you didn't need a lot of lyrics for stuff like Atmospheric Strut and Cloud, Disco Juice, but you could get away with stuff like Ladybug. You could get away with In the Bush, because everybody was getting horny. Everybody was on the dance floor horny, trying to get in some Bush back then. And Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair, that's just perfect. I think that's probably one of the perfect records for the end of disco. I mean, Good Times by Chic is probably disco's best eulogy, but Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair is a close second. It is. Because when you think about 1979, here's what you have in the first half of that year that ends up, being disco's last gasp. Uh, I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor started in 78, but of course it went all the way over to 79. You have Good Times by She. You have Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair by Inner Life. Those three records are just like disco's perfect eulogy. Unfortunately, because Steve Dahl and his army of idiots decided that, we're done with disco. And disco didn't have much of a say in the matter, unfortunately, because as Gloria Gaynor said on the 2-hour Disco Unsung, which I wish TV One would run back one of these days, is that disco, that New York and LA don't run the world, Middle America does. I mean, we're still finding that out today. And when people in these Midwestern remote outposts were finding out that, disco was very much in nature, it really offended people. And that's what happened. That's why Steve Dahl found an end. He found an end in homophobia. He found an end in misogyny. He found an end in racism and said, all right, disco demolition night. We're going to blow up all these disco records because we have to appeal to the American sensibility. What a joke. A sick joke. And that's why people like Patrick Adams and Nile Rodgers and so many others who ate in the 70s struggled. Well, Nile didn't struggle in the 80s because Nile was just so insanely talented that people just couldn't refuse him. But a lot of others just kind of sort of fell by the wayside because nobody was rocking with disco by the time the 80s came around. And yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned that electro saved black music and R&B in the early 80s, but it probably felt bad to a lot of those disco musicians because now you could do stuff on keyboards and synths and Moog synthesizers and drum machines started to become a thing because you had the Lindrum L1, you had the TR-808 that was becoming a thing, the 909 that replaced it. It was hard for musicians in the 80s because somebody got so upset about gay people and women and trans people and blacks and Latinos dancing in the club in the 70s that the entire music industry had to suffer. And that, took away from a lot of people. That's why I say Patrick Adams is the J-Dilla of disco, because he was like the underground disco genius that didn't get his props until later on in life. And he probably deserved every bit of the credit that he got right up until his dying day. And if you haven't listened to any of those records that I mentioned, Atmospheric Strut, Ladybug, Disco Juice, Caught Up in a One Night Love Affair, Push Push in the Bush, a few other records that escape me at the moment, but you can look up Patrick Adams' catalog, and he has some good stuff on there. He absolutely does. So I highly recommend you check him out. It was fun to talk about and learn about him in mass. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that you could just Google Patrick Adams producer, because Patrick Adams is also the name of an actor, I believe, and I think it's either Europe or Irish or British actor. But if you Google Patrick Adams producer, there's a treasure trove and a wealth of information about just how dope of a musician this man was and how he flew under the radar for so long. And it was good to see him get his props before he passed on in 2022.